my name is Mary and I'm the designer behind Maiden Mary Designs. In this video, I'm going to show you a step-by-step tutorial of how to sew the Riviera dress. We will be doing view A, which is the gathered bust and the midi length dress. I will also be explaining the steps for the bustier style, and also the steps are the same for the shorter length dress as well. In this video, we will be doing the original design, which is a wide strap for the dress. And then in a separate video, I will be showing how to add a puff sleeve if you would like to add a little puff design. And this add-on pattern piece is available at maidenmarydesigns.com, as well as the pocket bags if you would like to add those to your dress. Before getting started with cutting fabric and sewing, it is very, very important to look at the size chart and assess what size or sizes you will be blending between or across, and also read the pages on sewing a toile. Since this design is more of a fitted bodice, a corset style bodice with a drop waist, it is very, very important to tailor it to your body. And so that's why we start with sewing a toile. You can use remnants of fabric, or you can use a thrifted textile or a bed sheet. Just make sure that that fabric is a similar style and weight to the finished garment fabric that you will be using. In addition to this dress being fitted through the bodice, it is also drafted for my height, which is 5 feet 10 inches or 178 centimeters. And the bust cups are made for an A cup. And so if you need to adjust the height or the cup size, there are step-by-step instructions in the instructions manual, both for a full bust adjustment as well as shortening or lengthening the torso through the bodice, or also the hem length. So once you have sewn your toile and you're happy with the fit, you can go ahead and cut out the pattern pieces to sew your Riviera dress, and we will get started with the first steps. This step is specifically for if you would like to add pockets to your skirt. This is optional, but if you'd like to do that, this is an example of how to do it. Instead of cutting the gathered skirt on the fold, we are going to be cutting 4 individual gathered skirt pieces. Here I'm cutting it 1 centimeter wider than that fold mark to add in a seam allowance. Then you can cut out the rest of the gathered skirt along the outside edges. Notice that there is a shorter length for the front than there is on the back, so be sure to cut 2 mirrored of the front and 2 mirrored of the back length. Next, finish the raw edge of that straight seam allowance cut, either on a serger or on your machine with a zigzag stitch. Next, we're going to finish all of the raw edges on our 4 pocket bags, either on your serger or with a zigzag stitch. Place 1 pocket with right sides together on your gathered skirt piece. Be sure that that upper top corner is along the edge of the gathered skirt, while the lower top corner is 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters down from that top edge. Pin the opposite side of the skirt mirrored, and be sure that you have the front skirt and the back skirt mirrored to each other. Then sew the side seams in place. Fold over your pocket and give it a nice press, then edge stitch the seam allowance in place. Now place your front skirt on top of your back skirt with the right sides together. Pin the side seam in place and pin around the curved edge of the pocket. Using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, sew down that tiny 2 centimeter notch at the top of the skirt. Lower the needle and raise the presser foot to rotate around that corner. Then continue across the top of the pocket, sew around the pocket, and then back down the side seam of the skirt down to the hem. Unfold your gathered skirt piece, and this is how your pocket should look. Then we're going to give it a good steamy press to get a nice flat seam on that side gathered skirt before sewing the dress. Pin the side back bodice piece to the long edge of the side front bodice piece, then sew with right sides together with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Afterward, finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch or with your serger machine. Unfold the panel and press the seam allowance toward the back bodice piece. If you have a pocket sewn into your gathered skirt, move it out of the way while we gather that top edge of the gathered skirt piece. Increase the stitch length, then increase the tension for the top thread. Sew 5 millimeters or 1/4 inch from the top edge of the gathered skirt piece. Do not backstitch at the beginning or the end. Stitch all the way across to the other end of the skirt. Avoid the pocket if you have a pocket, and leave a long tail of thread on either end of your gathering stitches. This is optional, but for extra even gathers, you can sew a second row of gathering stitches. This will help you out to space out those gathers evenly, and also if one of your gathering stitches happens to break, you will still have the second row of gathering stitches to help you out. Adjust the gathers to align the top of the skirt with the bottom of the side panel that you sewed in step 1. Pin the gathers in place with the right sides together to the side panel. Double check that the shorter side of the skirt is in line with the front of the bodice. Change the stitch length and tension on your machine back to the standard settings, then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance across the top of the gathered skirt, attaching it to the bottom of the bodice side panel. Finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch or serger. If you're sewing the pocket, we are going to secure the top corner of the pocket by anchoring it to the seam allowance of the gathered skirt. Take that top corner, pin it to 1 centimeter away from that side edge of the gathered skirt, then back tack well on the seam allowance. Place the center front pattern piece on top with right sides together, pin in place along the edge, then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. We will want that waist seam to be folded up toward the bodice. Repeat these steps by placing your sewn side panel on the other side of the center front pattern piece. Pin in place and sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Align the curved side of the center back pattern piece with the side panel of your sewn pieces. Pin right sides together and sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to finish all of the raw edges of our vertical seams, as well as that raw edge of the center back opening, which is where we're going to sew in the zipper. This is how your dress should be looking so far. Now that we have all of the seam allowances finished, we're going to press them. So we're going to press the seam allowances away from the gathered skirt panel. The side seam above the gathered skirt is going to be pressed toward the back. And then you can just flip it over to the front side and make sure all of the seam allowances are nice and neat from the outside. Fold the raw edge at the top of the bodice down 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch and press. Fold again with wrong sides together, creating a double fold, press and pin in place. Starting at the bust opening, sew with a 5 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance, then stop at the second seam where the side panel meets the center back pattern piece. Place the side bust cup on the center bust with right sides together, pin in place, aligning the notches, then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you're sewing the bustier style views D or E, you're going to be repeating these steps so that you have 2 of this bust section. Press the seams open, and to get a nice finished press, you can use a tailor's ham. Fold the strap in half long way with right sides together and pin in place. Sew the long edge with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Turn the straps right side out. Here I'm using a loop turner, but you could also use a safety pin and it works just as easily. So we're going to turn it right side out, and then we will be pressing the seam in the center of the strap. We're going to use a longer stitch length and a higher tension setting to sew a gathering stitch on one end of the strap. Leave a long tail of thread on either end and do not backstitch. Tie off one side of the thread tails, then gather the stitches together in the middle and tie tightly the thread on the other side of the stitches. We're going to pin the gathered end of the strap 1 inch or 3 centimeters from the edge of the bust section. If you're going to later be adding a puff sleeve or you are sewing views D or E, you're going to have a flat end like this of your strap. We're going to sew it in place 5 millimeters or 1/4 inch from the raw edge with the strap seam facing the lining. Place the bust lining on the gathered bust rectangle with right sides together and pin along the top. The straps should be sandwiched between the lining and the gathered bust piece. Sew together with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowance toward the bust lining, then understitch by sewing with a 5 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance from that seam line. Be sure that your straps are pushed away to the side toward the gathered bust section so that they don't get sewn into the understitching. Fold over the gathered bust section and press along the top seam. We're going to sew gathering stitches along the two sides of the gathered bust section. So increase the settings on your machine to a longer stitch length and a higher tension. Leaving a long tail of thread and without backstitching at either end, sew a gathering stitch along the side of the gathered bust rectangle. We're going to repeat this on the opposite side of this same panel. This is how it should look after sewing the two sides with the gathering stitches. Now adjust the gathering stitches evenly until the gathered panel fits the height of your bust lining. This is where it gets fun with fabric manipulation. You can pull the sides, you can pinch together the fabric, use the iron and a high steam setting to get those pleats or gathers to set in place. But have fun just taking your time adjusting the little bits of fabric as you go until you get it to a place that you're satisfied with how it looks. So here you can see I'm really just adjusting each individual pleat or fold and then ironing as I go to set them in place. I continue modifying and moving around these little folds and pleats until I get it really well distributed and I like how it all looks cohesive but not a uniform pleat. Take your time adjusting the fabric and moving around and manipulating the gathers until you're happy with how it looks, and then we will stitch them in place. Pin the gathers along the edge of the bust lining and sew a basting stitch with 5 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance from the edge of the lining with wrong sides together. Now that the gathers are stitched in place, trim away the excess fabric from the gathered bust panel, cutting along the edge of the bust lining. Pin the bust section right sides together to the center front panel of the dress. Align the seams in place with the seams on the dress. This is especially important if you are sewing the bustier style because visually you would want the princess seams to be aligned. Then we're going to align the corner of the bust section with the underarm of the dress. After pinning in place the corners, you're going to ease in that curve around the edge of the bust section. At the corner here, because it's angled, be sure to pin the two pieces in place so that they match up at the 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. That way when it unfolds and you're wearing the dress, it will have a nice smooth transition from the bust to the underarm. Now we're going to sew the bust section in place using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Take this step slowly and adjust the dress fabric underneath the bust section as you go. Because it's going around a curve, it requires some slowing down, lowering the needle, and adjusting the fabric as you go so that there aren't any sections that pinch up. However, if you do get parts of the dress that do pinch, just remove a few stitches right at that point and then you can do it again. That's what I did here. I had one spot that folded. I removed a few stitches, sewed it again, and it's good to go. The seam allowance here at the underarm angles up, so we are going to use some snips to trim it down at an angle. That way when it opens up, it will not be visible. And then finish the raw edge on a serger or with a zigzag stitch around the bust section. Leave a tail of thread so that you can tie off the ends of the stitch on both sides of the bust section. To keep the seam allowance extra secure, you can add a few hand-sewn tacking stitches for the seam allowance to the inside of the bust section. We're going to pin or clip up the back of the dress so that we can try it on for a fit assessment. Pin the center back with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then from the top, measure down 12.5 inches or 32 centimeters and secure it with a safety pin. Carefully put the dress on over your head. If it goes on comfortably, you can use a 35 centimeter or 14 inch invisible zipper. If the opening is a little too snug to put on comfortably, use a 50 centimeter or 20 inch zipper. Snip the excess zipper tape at the top of the zipper above the plastic stoppers. Cut a 5 by 5 centimeter square of fabric, then align the edge of the fabric at the bottom of the zipper. Sew below the last zipper tooth with a seam allowance of 5 millimeters or 1/4 inch. Fold the piece of fabric down, then iron the fold in place. Fold the bottom up 5 millimeters or 1/4 inch and press, then fold in the sides to meet at the edge of the zipper tape. Press again, and then we're going to fold up the bottom of the fabric to enclose all of the raw edges. Give it another good press, pin it in place, and then edge stitch the fabric in place. I'm using just a seam ripper. You can use a stiletto or a small pencil to hold that piece in place and slowly sew across the zipper. Unzip the zipper and on a very low heat setting, iron the zipper teeth open so that you are ready to install the zipper in your dress. Lay the dress flat with the right side of the fabric facing up. Place the zipper with the right side down, aligning the top of the zipper with the fold that is 2 centimeters from the top of the dress. And pin the zipper tape with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Along the edge of the zipper tape, sew a basting stitch. This will help to keep the zipper in place before we're sewing very, very close to the zipper teeth. Lay the dress inside out with the center back seam facing up. Place the second side of the zipper right side down on the opposite seam allowance. Align the top of the zipper in the same position at that fold that is 2 centimeters away from the top of the dress. Make sure that the zipper aligns on both sides of the dress. Sew a basting stitch to help hold the zipper in place before we sew close to the zipper teeth in the next step. I would suggest using a zipper foot to get extra close to the zipper teeth for the invisible zipper. Here we're sewing in the crease between the teeth and the zipper tape. The closer that you get to the teeth, the more invisible the zipper will be. However, you don't want to cross over the zipper teeth at any point because that will prevent the zipper from zipping up. If there are certain spots that are maybe too far away or it gets stuck and doesn't zip because it's too close, you can just unpick those stitches in that small section and sew it again. Fold the top of the dress over the zipper 2 centimeters and then place a pin at the 1 centimeter fold. The fabric will be right sides together, but the right side of the fabric fold will be to the wrong side of the zipper. Repeat this step on the other side and make sure that the top of the zipper is even on both sides. At the 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch fold, sew from the zipper teeth to the edge of the fabric. Turn the fabric right side out and then fold the 1 centimeter seam allowance underneath so that the raw edge is tucked inside. Pin the fold in place, then we're going to measure our straps to pin it to the back side. I like my strap to be at 16 inches or 40.5 centimeters. Then I'm adding 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters of seam allowance to the end of my straps. Insert the end of the strap under the folded seam allowance, then fold it up and pin in place. The edge of the strap should be right in line with the seam. Then we're going to edge stitch along that fold until it meets the rest of the seam at the edge of the strap. At the top edge of the dress, we are going to stitch the strap in place on the seam allowance and make sure to back tack well at either end to make sure that that strap is very secure. Using a hand needle and matching thread, hand stitch the hook and eye in place on the seam allowance. Be sure not to sew all the way through to the outside of the dress, but just lightly tack on the inside of the seam allowance so that those stitches are not visible from the outside of the dress. Pin the center back seam with right sides together from the bottom of the zipper down to the hem of the dress. Starting at the bottom of the zipper, sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Get as close as you can using a zipper foot to the edge of that zipper so you can close in the gap between the zipper and the center back seam. Using a high steam setting, press the center back seam open, then turn the dress right side out and press the seam again just to make sure that that zipper is laying nice and flat. Fold up the hem of the skirt 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch and press. Continue all the way around the hem of the skirt, then repeat and fold 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch again to create a double fold. Pin in place, then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Beautifully done! Your Riviera dress is now complete. I hope you enjoyed the process of sewing this dress, and if you share pictures on Instagram, tag Maiden Mary Designs. I would love to see your creation.